They thought I was the family failure until the best man stood up, saluted, and called me General Hayes, ma'am, in front of 200 wedding guests. What happened next turned my parents' world upside down and revealed a truth that had been hidden for 7 years. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The champagne glass slipped from my mother's fingers and shattered against the marble floor of the Rosewood Country Club. The sound echoed through the suddenly silent reception hall like a gunshot. Every conversation stopped, every head turned, and there I was, standing in my discount department store dress, watching my entire family's perception of reality crumble in real time. But let me start from the beginning of that humiliating day. It was supposed to be perfect. My younger brother David's wedding to his college sweetheart, Rebecca. The kind of fairy tale event my parents had dreamed about since he was born. Their golden child finally settling down with a respectable woman from a good family. The venue was spectacular. Crystal chandeliers, white roses everywhere, and a reception hall that probably cost more than I made in 6 months. Or at least more than they thought I made. I'd driven 8 hours from my tiny apartment in Millfield to be here. 8 hours of dreading this moment, knowing exactly how it would go. My parents had made their feelings about my life choices crystal clear over the years. While David had become a successful investment banker with a corner office in downtown Asherton, I was, in their eyes, a disappointment who couldn't hold down a steady job. The mockery started during the cocktail hour. "Oh, Catherine's here," my mother, Patricia Hayes, announced to her circle of friends with that particular tone she reserved for discussing my failures. "Our wandering daughter finally graced us with her presence." I was standing barely 10 feet away, nursing a glass of wine and trying to blend into the wallpaper, but Patricia Hayes had never been one for subtlety. "Still between jobs, dear?" asked Mrs. Pemberton, one of my mother's tennis partners, with fake sympathy dripping from her voice. "Something like that," I replied quietly, hoping to end the conversation. But my father, Richard Hayes, had spotted me from across the room and was making his way over with that familiar look of disappointment etched into his features. Behind him trailed David's future father-in-law, a prominent businessman whose approval my parents desperately craved. "Catherine," he said, his voice carrying that edge of embarrassment he always had when discussing me in public. "Mr. Thornton was just asking about your situation." The way he said situation made it sound like a disease. "Still figuring things out, I assume?" asked Mr. Thornton with the kind of polite disinterest reserved for people he considered beneath his notice. "Tad, please," I whispered, feeling the familiar burn of humiliation creeping up my neck. "It's just concerning," my mother chimed in loud enough for half the cocktail hour to hear. 32 years old and still can't seem to find her place in the world. We worry, you know. All those mysterious trips, never a straight answer about what she actually does for work. Mrs. Pemberton clucked her tongue sympathetically. "Some children just take longer to mature, Patricia. I'm sure she'll find something eventually." "Eventually," my father repeated with a bitter laugh. "Catherine's been eventually for the past decade. While David was building his career, earning his MBA, making something of himself, Catherine has been, well, we're not entirely sure what Catherine has been doing." The circle of their friends nodded with knowing looks. Here was the Hayes family's dirty secret, the successful banker's son and the failure daughter who couldn't get her life together. "I heard she was working at some sort of consulting firm," another family friend offered, trying to be helpful. "If you can call it that," my mother said with a dismissive wave. "She's so secretive about it. Never talks about her work, never brings anyone home to meet us. We think she might be embarrassed about whatever it is she actually does." The truth was, I couldn't talk about my work. Not because I was embarrassed, but because revealing any details about my real job would violate about 16 different federal laws and put national security at risk. But I couldn't explain that to them. I'd been living this double life for so long that sometimes even I forgot which version of myself I was supposed to be. "Well," Mr. Thornton said, with the finality of someone eager to change subjects, "I'm sure she'll figure it out eventually. Now, about David's promotion." And just like that, I was dismissed. The conversation moved on to my brother's latest achievement while I stood there feeling like I was 12 years old again, being lectured about my report card. The dinner was worse. They'd seated me at the kids' table, literally. While David and Rebecca sat at the head table with their wedding party, I found myself surrounded by teenagers and children, the only adult family member deemed unworthy of sitting with the grown-ups. During the toasts, my father stood up with his champagne glass hazed high. "To my son David, who has always made us proud with his dedication, his success, and his commitment to excellence. David represents everything we hoped our children would become." He paused, and for one terrible moment, I thought he might actually mention me. Instead, he simply raised his glass higher. "To David and Rebecca, who show us what it looks like when young people take responsibility for their lives and build something meaningful." The implication was clear. David had built something meaningful. I had not. Rebecca's father followed with his own toasts, praising David's character and work ethic. Then came the best man's turn. Colonel James Morrison, though I didn't know his rank yet, stood up slowly. He was tall, probably in his mid-40s, with the kind of bearing that commanded attention without trying. His tuxedo was impeccable, but there was something about the way he carried himself that seemed almost military. "I've known David for 3 years," he began, his voice clear and authoritative. "He's a good man, a loyal friend, and he's going to make an excellent husband." Standard best man speech so far. I was only half listening, still stinging from my father's pointed toast. "But tonight," Colonel Morrison continued, "I want to talk about something else, about honor, about service, and about the sacrifices that people make for their country. Sacrifices that often go unrecognized by the very people who benefit from them." Something in his tone made me look up. He was scanning the room, and for just a moment, his eyes met mine. "Sometimes," he said, his voice carrying a weight that silenced even the children at my table, "the most heroic people in a room are the ones no one knows are heroes." My heart started beating faster. This was beginning to sound less like a wedding toast and more like something else entirely. "David," Colonel Morrison said, turning back to the groom, "you're lucky to have a family that supports you, but you're especially lucky to have a sister who has spent the last 7 years serving her country with distinction, courage, and honor." The room went dead silent. I could feel every eye in the place turning toward me, but I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. Colonel Morrison's eyes found mine again, and this time they stayed there. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, his voice ringing with authority, "I have the honor of introducing someone's service record I'm not allowed to discuss in detail, but whose rank I am absolutely permitted to acknowledge." He set down his champagne glass and did something that made my mother's glass slip from her nerveless fingers. He came to attention and saluted. "General Catherine Hayes, ma'am, it's an honor to serve under your command." The silence that followed was deafening. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. For 7 years, my family had constructed an elaborate story about my life. In their version, I was the black sheep who couldn't get her act together, a cautionary tale they'd whisper about at dinner parties and family gatherings. According to my parents, I was a drifter, someone who jumped from job to job, never staying anywhere long enough to build a real career. They'd tell people I worked for some consulting company with the kind of vague dismissiveness that suggested they didn't really believe it themselves.
Catherine has always been restless, my mother would explain to concerned relatives. She gets these ideas about traveling, about working in different places. We think she might have commitment issues. The evidence, from their perspective, was damning. I'd disappear for weeks or months at a time with minimal contact. When I did call, I was evasive about where I was or what I was doing. I lived in a modest apartment in a small town instead of pursuing the kind of high-powered career they expected from their children. I drove an old car, wore simple clothes, and never seemed to have much money to spend on luxuries. "She's 32 and still acts like she's fresh out of college," my father would complain. "No steady boyfriend, no mortgage, no 5-year plan. It's like she's afraid to grow up." To them, my secretiveness wasn't professionalism, it was shame. They assumed I was embarrassed about whatever dead-end job I'd managed to land. Maybe I was working retail, or as a low-level administrative assistant somewhere. The kind of job that ambitious people my age would consider beneath them. "We offered to help," my mother would tell her friends with martyred patience. "Richard has connections. He could have gotten her interviews at several firms in Asherton. But Catherine insists on doing things her own way, even if her way isn't working." My brother David had bought into this narrative completely. To him, I was the irresponsible older sister who'd wasted her potential. While he'd followed the prescribed path, good grades, prestigious college, MBA, corner office, I'd chosen to drift aimlessly through life without direction or ambition. "I worry about her," he'd tell people, shaking his head with the patronizing concern of someone who'd figured out how life worked. "She's smart enough, but she just can't seem to settle down and commit to anything real." The wedding guest list itself told the story they believed. David's side was filled with successful friends, business associates, and accomplished couples, people with titles and achievements they could brag about. My side was empty. Because how do you introduce someone whose biggest accomplishment, as far as you know, is managing to keep whatever mysterious job they have for more than 6 months? Even the seating arrangement reflected their assessment of my status. While David sat with his groomsmen, a collection of bankers, lawyers, and business executives, I was relegated to the children's table, not because there wasn't room elsewhere, but because that's genuinely where they thought I belonged, among people who hadn't figured out what they wanted to be when they grew up. The whispered conversations during cocktail hour weren't cruel exactly. They were the kind of concerned murmurings that families have about relatives who've lost their way. Mrs. Pemberton asking if I was still between jobs wasn't malicious. It was the natural question when someone's employment history looked, from the outside, like a series of false starts and failed attempts.
"We just don't understand what happened," my mother had confessed to her sister the week before the wedding, not knowing I could hear her from the kitchen. "Catherine was such a bright child, good grades, leadership potential, and then somewhere along the way, she just lost focus, started making these strange choices." My aunt had made sympathetic noises. "Some people are late bloomers, Patricia. Maybe she just needs more time to find herself." "She's had 12 years since college to find herself," my mother had replied with exasperation. "At some point, you have to stop finding yourself and start building something." This was their truth. I was a disappointment who'd chosen an unconventional path because I wasn't capable of succeeding on a conventional one. I was the family member they loved but didn't respect, worried about but couldn't help, included but didn't celebrate. Even my appearance at the wedding reinforced their beliefs. While other guests wore designer dresses and expensive jewelry, I'd shown up in a simple black dress from a department store clearance rack. My hair was pulled back in a basic ponytail. No manicure, no elaborate makeup, no accessories that screamed success or sophistication. To everyone in that room, I looked exactly like what they thought I was. Someone who'd never quite figured out how to be an adult. Someone who was still playing dress-up while the real grown-ups got on with the business of building careers, accumulating wealth, and achieving the kind of visible success that makes parents proud. The narrative was so complete, so consistent, that even I sometimes wondered if they were right. When you spend years hiding who you really are, when you can't share your achievements or explain your absences, when you have to watch your family celebrate your brother's promotions while treating your own career like a shameful secret, sometimes you start to question whether the life you're actually living is as meaningful as you tell yourself it is. But that was about to change. Because Colonel Morrison hadn't just stood up to give a standard best man speech. He'd stood up to shatter 7 years of carefully constructed assumptions with 5 words that would rewrite everything my family thought they knew about Catherine Hayes. The woman they'd dismissed as a failure was about to be revealed as something they'd never even imagined was possible. The silence stretched like a taut wire, ready to snap. Colonel Morrison's salute hung in the air, crisp and unwavering, while 200 wedding guests sat frozen in their chairs, champagne glasses halfway to their lips, trying to process what they'd just witnessed. But it was the look on my parents' faces that hit me like a physical blow. My mother's mouth had fallen open, her carefully applied lipstick smudged where she'd pressed her hand against it in shock. My father's face had gone completely white, then flushed deep red as the implications began to sink in. These weren't just any parents discovering their daughter's secret. These were Richard and Patricia Hayes, people whose entire social identity was built on their children's achievements, whose dinner party conversations revolved around David's latest promotion and Catherine's latest disappointment. The betrayal I saw in their eyes wasn't about my military service. It was about the fact that for 7 years, I'd let them believe I was a failure. I'd sat through countless lectures about responsibility and commitment while holding one of the highest ranks in the United States military. I'd listened to their worried phone calls about my future while commanding operations they'd never be cleared to know about. I'd accepted their pity, their disappointment, their barely concealed shame, all while protecting secrets that could alter the course of international conflicts. My father was the first to find his voice, though it came out as barely more than a croak. General? The word hung in the air like an accusation, not question-seeking clarification, but a challenge to everything they thought they knew about their daughter, their family, their own judgment. "Richard," my mother whispered, her hand reaching blindly for his arm without taking her eyes off me. Did he call Catherine? Patricia Hayes was a woman who prided herself on never being caught off guard. She was the one who planned charity events with military precision, who could navigate complex social situations with the skill of a diplomat. She knew exactly which fork to use at formal dinners, which wine to serve with which course, how to make small talk with senators' wives and Supreme Court justices. But she'd never prepared for the possibility that her disappointing daughter might outrank most of the people she spent her life trying to impress. David looked like he had been physically struck. His perfect wedding day, his moment of triumph, had just been overshadowed by the sister he'd written off as a cautionary tale. For 29 years, he'd been the golden child, the one who made the right choices, followed the right path, achieved the right kind of success. The comparison between us had always been favorable to him, the responsible younger brother versus the flighty older sister who couldn't get her life together. But a general? Generals are the people who briefed presidents. Generals are the ones who made decisions that affected millions of lives. Generals are the heroes in the movies David watched, the leaders he'd grown up admiring from a distance, never imagining he'd ever actually meet one, let alone be related to one.
Rebecca, my new sister-in-law, was staring at me with a mixture of awe and confusion that would have been comical under different circumstances. She'd met me exactly 3 times before this wedding. Each time, I'd been introduced as David's sister, the one who travels a lot for work. Rebecca had been polite but distant, clearly wondering why David's family couldn't be more specific about what his sister actually did for a living. Now she was probably wondering if she'd accidentally snubbed a general of the United States military at family gatherings. The wedding guests were beginning to murmur among themselves, conversations starting and stopping as people tried to process what they'd witnessed. Mrs. Pemberton was clutching her pearls, literally clutching them, while staring at me with the expression of someone who'd just discovered that the quiet woman she'd been patronizing was actually royalty in disguise. Mr. Thornton, David's future father-in-law, who'd dismissed me with polite indifference during cocktail hour, looked like he was mentally reviewing every interaction we'd ever had, probably wondering if he'd inadvertently offended someone who could make his government contracts very complicated. But it was my parents' reaction that cut the deepest, because this wasn't just about rank or achievement or even respect. This was about trust. For 7 years, I'd been coming to family dinners, holiday gatherings, and special occasions while carrying the weight of classified operations and life-or-death decisions. I'd listened to their advice about my career, their suggestions for getting serious about my future, their gentle but persistent pressure to settle down and make something of myself. And through it all, I'd said nothing. Not because I didn't trust them with my life, but because I couldn't trust them with information that could endanger others' lives. Military classification isn't just about keeping secrets. It's about protecting operations, personnel, and national interests that are bigger than any one person or family. But try explaining that to parents who'd spent 7 years worrying that their daughter was wasting her potential. "Catherine," my father said again, his voice stronger now, but shaking with emotion I couldn't quite identify. Anger? Hurt? Pride? How long? It was such a simple question, but loaded with 7 years of misunderstanding. How long had I been lying to them? How long had I been successful while they thought I was struggling? How long had I been someone important while they treated me like a disappointment? The truth was complicated. I'd been commissioned as a second lieutenant straight out of college. But my parents had known about that. They'd been proud when I joined the military. It was respectable, patriotic, the kind of service that looked good on Christmas cards. But when my assignments became classified, when I couldn't talk about my work, or my location, or even my rank progression, they'd assumed I was stuck in some dead-end military job that I was too embarrassed to discuss. They never imagined that my silence meant the opposite, that I'd risen so high in the ranks that even acknowledging my position required careful consideration of national security implications. "Mom, Dad," I started, but Colonel Morrison cleared his throat. "Ma'am, perhaps this conversation would be better suited for a more private setting." He was right, of course. We were still standing in front of 200 guests at my brother's wedding reception. Rebecca's grandmother was videotaping everything on her iPhone, probably uploading it to social media as we spoke. This wasn't the time or place for a detailed explanation of 7 years of necessary deception. But the damage was already done. The careful facade my family had maintained, the narrative they'd constructed about their disappointing daughter, had been shattered in front of everyone they knew. There would be no putting this particular genie back in the bottle. My mother's eyes filled with tears, whether from pride, hurt, or sheer overwhelm, I couldn't tell. My father was still staring at me like a stranger wearing his daughter's face. And David was looking between me and Colonel Morrison like he was trying to solve a puzzle with half the pieces missing. The wedding reception that was supposed to celebrate David and Rebecca's future had become something else entirely. The moment when Catherine Hayes stopped being the family disappointment and became someone her parents weren't sure they even knew. What most people didn't understand was that my parents hadn't just stumbled into their negative opinion of me. They had built it methodically, piece by piece, over 7 years of carefully documented evidence that painted me as an irresponsible disappointment. Every birthday dinner, every holiday gathering, every family phone call had become another opportunity for them to catalog my apparent failures and present them as proof of their concerns. It started small, the way these things always do. When I missed my cousin Sarah's graduation because I was deployed to a classified location in Eastern Europe, my mother made a note of it. Catherine couldn't make it, she told the extended family, with that particular tone that suggested this was part of a larger pattern. Work again. The way she said work made it sound like an excuse rather than a legitimate obligation. When I couldn't attend my father's 60th birthday party because I was coordinating a joint operation with NATO forces, my parents turned it into a story about my priorities. We had hoped Catherine would be here, my father announced to the gathered relatives, but apparently whatever she's doing these days is more important than family. They kept a mental ledger of every missed event, every vague explanation, every time I had to leave suddenly or couldn't provide details about where I was going. What they saw as selfishness and irresponsibility was actually the reality of serving at the highest levels of military command. But I couldn't explain that without violating federal law.
The financial evidence was particularly damning in their eyes. While David was buying his first house, then upgrading to a larger one, then purchasing a vacation condo, I continued living in the same modest apartment in Millfield. When David bought his BMW, I was still driving my reliable but unremarkable Honda Civic. When David started shopping at expensive stores and dining at exclusive restaurants, I maintained the simple lifestyle that my security clearance and operational requirements demanded. "We're worried about Catherine financially," my mother confided to my aunt during a phone call I accidentally overheard. "She never seems to have any money. We think she might be living paycheck to paycheck, too proud to ask for help." The truth was that my salary as a general was substantial, but most of it went into secure accounts and investments that couldn't be easily traced or accessed. I lived modestly not because I couldn't afford better, but because flashy displays of wealth were incompatible with maintaining operational security. A general living under deep cover couldn't exactly drive around in a luxury car or live in a mansion that would invite questions about her income sources. My parents began to see patterns where none existed, connections that confirmed their growing belief that I was struggling. When I couldn't commit to attending David's engagement party 6 months in advance, they interpreted it as evidence that I couldn't plan ahead or make firm commitments. In reality, military operations don't work around family social calendars, and I genuinely didn't know if I'd be in the country, let alone available for parties. The relationship evidence was even more compelling to them. While David had a steady girlfriend who became a fiancée, who became a wife, I remained conspicuously single. No boyfriend at family gatherings, no wedding ring, no stories about romantic dinners or weekend getaways. "Catherine just can't seem to maintain a relationship," my mother would explain to concerned relatives. "We think she might have commitment issues. She travels so much for whatever it is she does, and she's so secretive about her life. What man would put up with that?" What they didn't understand was that maintaining personal relationships while operating at my level of classified work was nearly impossible. The men I met in professional settings were either colleagues who understood the demands of the job or civilians who couldn't understand why I couldn't talk about my work, couldn't commit to social events in advance, and frequently had to cancel plans at the last minute due to operational requirements. Dating someone meant either lying constantly about my life or finding someone with compatible security clearance who understood the lifestyle. Neither option lent itself to the kind of stable, public relationship my parents expected their daughter to display. My parents even turned my educational achievements against me. "Catherine was always so smart," my father would say, with a note of frustration, "which makes it even more disappointing that she hasn't done anything significant with her intelligence. All that potential, and look what she's done with it." They had no idea that I held advanced degrees in international relations and strategic studies, earned through intensive military education programs that were among the most rigorous in the world. They didn't know about the think tank papers I'd authored under classified pseudonyms, or the strategic assessments that influenced policy at the highest levels of government. The character assassination became a self-reinforcing narrative. Every family friend who asked about me received the same concerned update. Catherine was still struggling to find her direction, still living the same modest lifestyle, still unable to commit to anything long-term.
The family friends would nod sympathetically and share their own stories about relatives who'd taken longer to mature, never realizing they were discussing someone who briefed the Secretary of Defense on global security threats. My parents even recruited David into their campaign of concerned intervention. "Maybe you could talk to Catherine," my mother suggested after particularly frustrating phone calls where I couldn't provide satisfactory answers about my work or my plans. "She might listen to you. You figured out how to build a successful career. Maybe you could give her some guidance." These weren't malicious people trying to destroy my reputation. They were loving parents who genuinely believed their daughter was wasting her life, and they were trying to help in the only way they knew how. The problem was that their help was based on a fundamental misunderstanding of who I was and what I was doing with my life. The systematic nature of their concerns had created an unshakable conviction that I was a disappointment. Every piece of evidence they gathered reinforced their belief that I was irresponsible, uncommitted, and unsuccessful. The fact that I couldn't defend myself or provide alternative explanations only strengthened their case. By the time of David's wedding, they had 7 years of documented evidence that Catherine Hayes was the family member who'd failed to launch, failed to commit, and failed to live up to her potential. They had stories to back up their concerns, examples to share with worried relatives, and a complete narrative that explained everything about my life in terms they could understand. They had no idea that their careful documentation of my failures was actually a catalog of my service to my country. Every missed family event represented a mission that kept Americans safe. Every vague explanation protected operations that most people would never know existed. Every sign of my supposed irresponsibility was actually evidence of the highest level of professional responsibility imaginable.
Looking back, there had been signs all along. Tiny cracks in my carefully constructed cover story that should have made my family question their assumptions about my life. But when you're convinced someone is a failure, you tend to interpret even contradictory evidence through that lens. Take the phone calls, for instance. Not the ones I made to them, but the ones I received. My parents had noticed over the years that I got calls at odd hours, sometimes in the middle of family dinners, sometimes late at night when I was visiting home. The calls were brief, professional, and always resulted in me needing to leave immediately or reschedule plans. That's another thing my mother had complained to my father after I'd cut short a Christmas visit 3 years earlier. What kind of job requires someone to be on call like that? Doctors, maybe? Emergency services? But some vague consulting position? It doesn't make sense. What they didn't know was that the call I'd received that Christmas morning was from the Pentagon's Crisis Communications Center. A terrorist cell in Southeast Asia had been intercepted planning an attack on American diplomatic facilities, and I was needed to coordinate the response with our allies in the region. While my family was opening presents around the tree, I was in my rental car, receiving classified briefings through encrypted communications equipment that could have funded a small country's defense budget. Then there were the languages. I'd always been good with languages in school, but over the years, my family had noticed me taking calls in what sounded like Arabic, speaking what appeared to be fluent German to someone on the phone, or quickly switching between English and what might have been Korean during brief conversations that ended with me apologizing and stepping outside. "Catherine's always practicing those language tapes," my mother would tell her friends, shaking her head with fond exasperation. "We think it's some kind of hobby she's picked up. Maybe she thinks it will help her get a better job someday." The reality was that I spoke 6 languages fluently and could conduct basic operational communications in 4 others. The calls weren't practice sessions. They were real-time coordination with intelligence assets, military liaisons, and allied commanders across the globe. When I switched to Arabic mid-conversation, it was because the situation required it, not because I was showing off or practicing pronunciation. My physical condition should have been another clue. While David had developed the soft edges that come with a desk job and client dinners,
I had maintained the kind of fitness level that raised questions. Not obviously muscular, but with a core strength and endurance that couldn't be explained by weekend yoga classes or casual gym membership. "Catherine's always athletic," my father would say when relatives commented on my fitness, "but she takes it a bit too seriously for someone her age. All those early morning runs, those intense workout sessions when she visits. We worry she might be obsessive about exercise because she's not fulfilled in other areas of her life." The reality was that maintaining peak physical condition wasn't optional in my line of work. When you're responsible for operations that might require you to evacuate quickly, navigate challenging terrain, or simply endure the physical demands of high-stress leadership, staying in shape isn't vanity, it's professional necessity. The technology hints were perhaps the most obvious, though my family had consistently misinterpreted them. I carried multiple phones, used encryption software they didn't recognize, and had electronic equipment in my apartment that looked far more sophisticated than someone in a basic consulting job would need. "She's always fiddling with those gadgets," my mother had observed during one visit, watching me quickly switch off a tablet when she entered the room. "We think she's one of those people who's addicted to technology. Maybe that's why she can't form real relationships. She's always staring at screens instead of talking to people." What she'd glimpsed on that tablet was a real-time satellite feed of a joint military exercise I was overseeing from a distance. The gadgets I was always fiddling with were secure communication devices that kept me connected to ongoing operations around the world. When I switched to Arabic mid-conversation, it was because the situation required it, not because I was being antisocial. The travel patterns should have been revealing too, not just the frequency of my trips, but the destinations that didn't quite make sense for someone in a nebulous consulting role. I'd mention being in Washington, D.C. frequently, sometimes with very short notice. I'd reference trips to locations that seemed oddly specific for business travel: Norfolk, Virginia, Colorado Springs, places that meant nothing to my family, but happened to house major military installations. "She says she travels for work, but she's so vague about where she goes and why. Sometimes we wonder if she's telling us the truth about her job. Maybe she's embarrassed about what she really does for a living." The irony was that I was being completely truthful about traveling for work. I just couldn't be specific about the nature of that work. When I said I was going to Colorado Springs for meetings, I was. Those meetings just happened to be at NORAD with officials who couldn't be named in conversations with civilians. Even my knowledge base should have raised questions. During family discussions about current events, I occasionally revealed information that seemed unusually detailed, or perspectives that were more nuanced than typical news coverage provided. When conflicts arose in international hotspots, I had insights that went beyond what CNN was reporting.
Catherine always thinks she knows more about these military situations than the experts, David had complained after I'd corrected some assumptions he'd made about a conflict in the Middle East. She watches too much news and thinks she understands geopolitics. It's kind of embarrassing when she argues with people who actually know what they're talking about. But I did know what I was talking about. When I corrected his assumptions about troop movements or strategic objectives, it wasn't because I'd read about them in newspapers, it was because I'd helped plan them. When I had nuanced perspectives on international conflicts, it was because I'd been briefed by the people making the decisions about those conflicts. The financial inconsistencies were subtle but present. While I lived modestly, I never seemed stressed about money. I never asked for financial help, never mentioned struggling to pay bills, never exhibited the behaviors of someone living paycheck to paycheck. Yet, I also never displayed obvious wealth or made purchases that would suggest a high income. "It's strange," my mother had confided to my aunt. "Catherine never seems to have money problems, but she also never seems to have much money. We can't figure out how she manages it. Maybe she's just very good at budgeting, or maybe she's not telling us when she's struggling." The truth was more complex. My financial situation was carefully managed to maintain operational security while ensuring I could respond to professional demands without creating traceable patterns that might compromise my cover. I wasn't struggling financially, but I also couldn't display wealth in ways that would invite questions about its source. Perhaps most telling of all was my comfort level with authority and high-pressure situations. When we encountered military or law enforcement personnel in public, I interacted with them with a familiarity that seemed unusual for a civilian. When crisis situations arose, medical emergencies, car accidents, moments when leadership was needed, I naturally took charge in ways that surprised my family. Catherine's always been bossy, my mother would say, not unkindly, but lately she seems to think she's in charge of everything. We think maybe her job involves some kind of supervisory role that's gone to her head. What they were seeing wasn't bossiness. It was command presence. When you spend your professional life making decisions that affect thousands of people, when you're trained to take control in crisis situations, when you're responsible for coordinating complex operations under pressure, those skills don't just disappear when you're off duty. All the pieces were there. The unexplained phone calls, the language skills, the physical fitness, the sophisticated technology, the travel patterns, the insider knowledge, the financial stability without obvious source, the natural leadership in crisis situations. Everything pointed to a life far more complex and significant than the struggling consulting job my family had imagined. But when you're convinced someone is a disappointment, you find ways to explain away evidence that contradicts that belief. Every sign that I might be living a more important life than they realized became another symptom of the problems they thought I had. Now, standing in that reception hall with Colonel Morrison's salute still hanging in the air, all those ignored clues were about to crystallize into a truth that would redefine everything my family thought they knew about Catherine Hayes. The journey to becoming General Catherine Hayes began on a Tuesday morning in my senior year at Westbrook University, when Professor Angela Martinez pulled me aside after our International Security Studies seminar and asked a question that would change the trajectory of my entire life. "Catherine, have you ever considered military service?" I was 21 years old, double majoring in political science and international relations, with a 3.9 GPA and plans to pursue graduate school in diplomacy. Military service wasn't on my radar. My family had no military background. My father was a corporate lawyer, my mother worked in nonprofit fundraising, and David was already showing signs of the business acumen that would later make him successful in finance. But Professor Martinez wasn't making casual conversation. She was a former State Department analyst who maintained connections throughout the intelligence and defense communities, and she'd been watching my academic performance with interest that went beyond typical mentorship. "There are opportunities in military intelligence that might align with your academic strengths," she continued, handing me a business card with just a name and phone number. "If you're interested in actually influencing international security policy rather than just studying it, you should make this call." The card belonged to Lieutenant Colonel Sarah Blackthorne, a military recruiter who specialized in identifying candidates for advanced intelligence positions. Our first meeting was nothing like the recruiting pitches shown in movies. No flags, no patriotic speeches, no promises of glory or adventure. Instead, Lieutenant Colonel Blackthorne presented military service as an intellectual challenge. We need people who can think strategically, who understand the complexities of international relations, and who can handle the pressure of making decisions that affect global stability. Your academic record suggests you might be that kind of person. The program she described was unlike anything I'd imagined military service could be. Instead of basic training followed by assignment to a traditional unit, I would attend officer candidate school, receive a commission as second lieutenant, and immediately enter an accelerated intelligence track that combined advanced education with hands-on operational experience. You'd be fast-tracked through strategic studies programs at some of the most advanced military education facilities in the world. Command and General Staff College, the Army War College, specialized programs in languages, regional studies, and strategic planning. Think of it as graduate school, but with real-world application and the authority to implement what you learn.
The timeline she outlined was aggressive. Commission as second lieutenant upon graduation, promotion to first lieutenant within 18 months, captain by year 3 if performance metrics were met. But the real acceleration would come through the specialized track I'd be entering, a program designed to identify and develop officers capable of reaching senior command positions earlier than traditional career paths allowed. "The military is changing," she told me during our second meeting. "Modern conflicts require leaders who understand cultural complexities, technological warfare, international law, and diplomatic implications. We can't afford to wait 20 years to promote people with your analytical capabilities to positions where those skills matter." My parents were thrilled when I told them about my decision to accept a commission. Military service was respectable, patriotic, and demonstrated the kind of commitment and purpose they'd been hoping to see from me. What I didn't tell them was that Lieutenant Colonel Blackthorne had already begun the process of obtaining security clearances that would eventually make it impossible for me to discuss the details of my military career with anyone outside the intelligence community. The initial phase was everything Lieutenant Colonel Blackthorne had promised. Officer candidate school at Fort Benning was intellectually and physically demanding, but designed for candidates with advanced educational backgrounds. While other new officers were learning basic leadership principles, our accelerated program was studying advanced strategic theory, international relations, and specialized warfare tactics. My first assignment was to the Defense Intelligence Agency as an analyst specializing in Middle Eastern political movements. It was fascinating work, synthesizing intelligence from multiple sources, briefing senior officials, and contributing to strategic assessments that influenced policy decisions. My parents were proud that I was serving my country, even if they didn't fully understand what my daily work involved. But it was during my second year, while working on an assessment of terrorist financing networks, that I caught the attention of people operating at levels far above the DIA. My analysis of cryptocurrency usage in international money laundering had identified patterns that existing intelligence frameworks had missed. Instead of just noting the discovery in my report, I developed a methodology that could potentially disrupt funding streams for multiple terrorist organizations. The phone call came on a Friday evening. I was in my apartment in Alexandria, working on weekend analysis, when an unlisted number appeared on my secure phone. "Lieutenant Hayes, this is Colonel Marcus Thornfield from Joint Special Operations Command. We need to discuss your recent work on financial network analysis. Can you be in my office Monday morning?" JSOC wasn't just another military command. It was where the military's most sensitive operations were planned and executed. Walking into Colonel Thornfield's office that Monday morning, I knew my career was about to take another unexpected turn. "Your methodology for tracking cryptocurrency transactions has applications beyond what you realize," Colonel Thornfield explained, showing me classified reports that demonstrated how my analysis had already been used to identify and disrupt 3 separate terrorist financing operations. "We'd like you to develop this work further, but it would require a different kind of assignment." The assignment he described would take me out of traditional military hierarchy and into what he called hybrid operations, missions that combined intelligence gathering, strategic analysis, and field coordination in ways that blurred the lines between different military specialties. You'd be working directly with special forces teams, CIA liaison teams, international partners, and sometimes civilian contractors. Your rank would advance rapidly to match your responsibilities, but your assignments would be classified at levels that would make it difficult to discuss your work with anyone outside your immediate chain of command. The promotion timeline he outlined was staggering. Captain within 6 months, major within 2 years, lieutenant colonel by year 4. But with each promotion would come increased responsibility for operations that officially didn't exist, in cooperation with agencies that couldn't be named, affecting outcomes that would never be publicly acknowledged. "The work you'd be doing matters more than almost anything else the military is involved in," Colonel Thornfield said, as I considered his offer. "But it would essentially require you to live a double life. Your family, your friends, even your military colleagues outside this program would never fully understand what you actually do for a living."
I accepted the assignment that day, not fully comprehending what I was agreeing to. Over the next 5 years, I would be deployed to locations that didn't appear on official military deployment records. I would coordinate operations with allied forces under agreements that required congressional notification, but not public disclosure. I would brief senators and cabinet members on threats that the public would never know existed. The promotions came exactly as Colonel Thornfield had predicted. Captain at 24, Major at 26, Lieutenant Colonel at 28. By 30, I was wearing the eagle of a full colonel and overseeing operations that spanned multiple continents. At 32, the star of a brigadier general was pinned to my uniform in a ceremony attended by exactly 7 people, none of whom were family members. Each promotion came with expanded responsibilities and deeper classification requirements. As a major, I'd coordinated with special forces teams conducting counterterrorism operations in North Africa. As a lieutenant colonel, I'd managed intelligence sharing agreements with NATO allies during crisis situations in Eastern Europe. As a colonel, I'd been part of strategic planning for operations that influenced the outcomes of regional conflicts without direct American military involvement. But it was the promotion to general that truly changed everything. Suddenly, I wasn't just implementing policy, I was helping to create it. The morning briefings I received contained information that would move stock markets if it became public. The decisions I participated in affected the deployment of billions of dollars in military resources and the safety of thousands of American personnel worldwide.
The irony was that as my actual responsibilities increased, my ability to share those achievements with my family decreased proportionally. The higher I rose in rank, the more my parents became convinced that I was struggling professionally. The more significant my contributions to national security became, the more they worried that I was wasting my potential. Standing in that wedding reception hall, watching my family's shocked faces as they processed Colonel Morrison's words, I realized that 7 years of necessary secrecy had created a gap between my real life and their perception that might be impossible to bridge. They were about to learn that their disappointing daughter was actually someone they'd never imagined she could become. But they were also about to understand that she'd been lying to them, by omission if not commission, for the entirety of her adult career. Understanding why my parents had been so determined to see me as a failure required understanding who Richard and Patricia Hayes really were beneath their carefully constructed social personas. They weren't cruel people or bad parents, but they were individuals whose entire sense of self-worth had become inextricably linked to their children's visible achievements, and my secretive lifestyle had threatened the very foundation of their identity. Richard Hayes had built his reputation as one of Asherton's most successful corporate attorneys through meticulous attention to detail and an almost obsessive need to control narratives. In his professional life, he specialized in crisis management for major corporations, helping companies navigate scandals, manage public perception, and maintain stakeholder confidence during difficult periods. His entire career was built on the principle that information could be managed, stories could be shaped, and outcomes could be controlled through careful presentation of facts. But Catherine Hayes was a problem he couldn't solve using his professional toolkit. Every attempt to gather information about my career hit walls he couldn't penetrate. Every effort to shape my narrative fell apart when I couldn't provide the details he needed to work with. For a man whose success depended on his ability to manage complex situations through information control, having a daughter whose life was essentially unmanageable represented a fundamental challenge to his competence. "I don't understand what's wrong with Catherine," he'd confided to his law partner during a golf game 2 years earlier, not knowing that David would later repeat the conversation to me. In my business, when someone won't provide straight answers about their work, it usually means they're hiding something problematic. Either they're involved in something questionable, or they're not as successful as they want people to believe.
Richard's worldview was shaped by decades of dealing with corporate executives who lied about financial performance, hid operational failures, and constructed elaborate deceptions to avoid accountability. When I exhibited similar patterns of secrecy and evasion, his professional instincts told me I was probably covering up some kind of failure or embarrassment. The psychological investment he'd made in this theory had grown over time. Every family gathering where I couldn't provide satisfactory career updates became additional evidence supporting his hypothesis. Every missed event or vague explanation reinforced his belief that I was struggling professionally and too proud to admit it. By the time of David's wedding, Richard Hayes wasn't just disappointed in his daughter, he was convinced he'd correctly diagnosed a problem that no one else in the family was willing to acknowledge. Patricia Hayes's motivations were more complex and perhaps more painful to witness. As the wife of a prominent attorney and mother of a successful investment banker, she'd built her social identity around being the kind of woman who raised accomplished children. Her charity boards that she served on were filled with women who spent significant portions of their conversations discussing their children's achievements. Medical school graduations, law firm partnerships, engagement announcements, grandchildren's accomplishments. These were the currency of social interaction among Patricia's peers. When other women shared updates about their successful children, Patricia could always respond with pride about David's latest promotion or achievement. But Catherine was becoming an increasingly difficult topic to navigate in these conversations. "How's your daughter doing, Patricia?" was a question that filled her with dread because she genuinely didn't know how to answer it. When other women talked about their daughters' careers, marriages, and life milestones, Patricia had to find ways to change the subject or offer vague responses that wouldn't invite follow-up questions. The social pressure had intensified over the years as David's success became more visible and my perceived failures became more apparent by comparison. Patricia found herself in the uncomfortable position of having one child who exceeded expectations and another who seemed to be underperforming dramatically. The contrast made family gatherings into performance anxiety events, where she had to carefully manage conversations to avoid highlighting the disparity. "We are so proud of David," became her standard response when people asked about her children, delivered with the kind of bright enthusiasm that was designed to prevent follow-up questions about Catherine. But the women in her social circle weren't fooled by this deflection. They knew Patricia well enough to notice that she only talked about one of her two children, and they drew their own conclusions about what that silence meant. The psychological toll of managing this social discomfort had transformed her concern for my well-being into something approaching resentment. She wasn't angry at me for failing. She was angry at me for making her look like a mother who'd failed. Every time she had to deflect questions about my career or make excuses for my absence from family events, she felt like I was forcing her to lie to protect my reputation at the expense of her own.
"Catherine doesn't make it easy for us to support her," she'd complained to her sister during a particularly frustrating phone call. "How are we supposed to be proud of her accomplishments when she won't tell us what her accomplishments are? How are we supposed to brag about her success when she acts like she doesn't have any?" The wedding itself had represented the culmination of years of social anxiety for both my parents. This was their chance to celebrate David's achievement in front of their entire social network, to demonstrate their success as parents through his obvious happiness and professional accomplishment. But my presence at the event had reminded everyone that the Hayes family had another child whose life was much less obviously successful. The seating arrangement that had placed me at the children's table wasn't just practical logistics. It was Patricia's attempt to minimize the visual reminder of her parenting failure. If Catherine was going to attend the wedding, at least she could be positioned in a way that wouldn't invite questions from other guests about why she seemed so disconnected from the family's success narrative. Richard's toast praising David while pointedly avoiding any mention of me hadn't been intentionally cruel. It had been his attempt to control the family narrative in front of an audience that included business associates, potential clients, and social contacts whose opinions could affect his professional reputation.
Acknowledging a daughter whose career couldn't be explained or celebrated would have opened conversations he wasn't prepared to navigate. The most painful aspect of their behavior was that it had become self-reinforcing. The more they treated me like a disappointment, the more evidence they found to support that assessment. When I responded to their criticism with silence rather than defending myself, they interpreted my lack of response as confirmation that their concerns were justified. When I continued to maintain the same modest lifestyle despite their suggestions for improvement, they saw it as evidence that I was either unable or unwilling to better my situation. Their love for me had become entangled with their frustration about their inability to understand or help me. They weren't trying to hurt their daughter. They were trying to figure out how to rescue her from what they perceived as a life of underachievement and missed opportunities. The fact that their rescue attempts were actually undermining someone who was serving her country at the highest levels was a tragedy of misunderstanding rather than malice. But standing in that reception hall, watching their faces as Colonel Morrison's words shattered 7 years of carefully constructed assumptions, I realized that their psychology had created a trap that none of us could escape without dramatic intervention. They'd become so invested in their version of Catherine Hayes that accepting the truth about who I really was would require them to acknowledge not just that they'd been wrong about my life, but that they'd been wrong about their own judgment, their understanding of success, and their ability to evaluate their own daughter's character and achievements. The revelation that was about to unfold wouldn't just change how they saw me. It would force them to question everything they thought they knew about themselves as parents, as judges of character, and as people whose opinions about their own children could be trusted. The weeks leading up to David's wedding had been the lowest point in my adult life, and that was saying something for someone who'd endured combat situations, diplomatic crises, and the kind of high-pressure military operations that most people couldn't imagine. But nothing in my professional experience had prepared me for the psychological weight of watching my own family systematically lose faith in me while being powerless to defend myself. It started with the engagement party incident 6 months earlier. I'd received urgent orders to deploy to a classified location in the Balkans to coordinate intelligence sharing with NATO allies during a crisis involving Russian military movements near the Ukrainian border. The operation required immediate departure and would last at least 2 weeks, which meant missing David and Rebecca's engagement celebration that my parents had been planning for months. The phone call to my mother was one of the most difficult conversations of my life. "Catherine, the invitations have been sent. People are expecting you. This is your brother's engagement party, not some casual get-together you can skip because something more interesting came up." I was standing in my apartment, already packed and waiting for my military transport, trying to find words that would convey the importance of my absence without revealing anything that could compromise operational security. "Mom, I understand how important this is, but I have a work emergency that I can't reschedule. It's not optional." "A work emergency?" Her voice rose in frustration. "Catherine, you work in consulting. What kind of consulting emergency requires you to disappear for 2 weeks with no notice? This is exactly the kind of behavior that makes us worry about your priorities." What I couldn't tell her was that the consulting emergency involved coordinating real-time intelligence that could prevent a military escalation between nuclear powers. The meetings I was missing her party to attend included discussions with intelligence chiefs from 6 different countries about Russian troop movements that could trigger the largest European conflict since World War II. But to Patricia Hayes, I was just her irresponsible daughter choosing work for family again. The fallout from missing that party was devastating in ways I hadn't anticipated. My parents didn't just express disappointment. They began openly questioning my character and judgment to other family members. My cousin Sarah called me 2 days later to tell me about conversations she'd overheard at the party.
Catherine, I think you should know what people are saying. Your mom told Aunt Linda that she's starting to think you might have some kind of addiction or mental health issue that you're not telling them about. She said your behavior has become so erratic and secretive that she's considering staging an intervention. An intervention. My mother was so convinced that my absences and inability to explain my work indicated personal problems that she was consulting with relatives about forcing me into some kind of treatment program. The psychological impact of that revelation was staggering. Here I was, serving my country at the highest levels, coordinating operations that were literally helping to prevent international conflicts, and my own mother was wondering if I needed to be committed to a rehabilitation facility. The isolation that followed was unlike anything I'd experienced. Military training prepares you for physical isolation, for being cut off from support systems during dangerous operations. But it doesn't prepare you for the emotional isolation of being misunderstood by the people who are supposed to love you unconditionally. I started avoiding family phone calls because every conversation became an interrogation about my work, my life choices, and my mental state. When I did speak with my parents, I could hear the worry and frustration in their voices, but underneath that was something worse. A growing resignation that suggested they were beginning to give up on me entirely. "We just don't know what to do about Catherine anymore," I overheard my father telling someone during a phone call when I was visiting for Christmas. "We've tried being supportive, we've tried being direct, we've offered to help, but you can't help someone who won't tell you what's wrong." The worst part was that they weren't wrong to be concerned. From their perspective, my behavior was genuinely worrying. A daughter who couldn't explain her work, who disappeared for weeks at a time, who lived modestly despite claiming to have a professional job, who avoided commitments and couldn't maintain relationships, that was exactly the profile of someone struggling with serious personal issues. But I couldn't explain the truth without violating federal law and potentially compromising ongoing operations. Every classified briefing I attended, every strategic planning session I participated in, every operation I coordinated came with legal warnings about the consequences of unauthorized disclosure. The oath I'd taken wasn't just ceremonial, it was a legally binding commitment that could result in court-martial, imprisonment, and destruction of national security assets if violated. So I watched helplessly as my family's perception of me deteriorated week by week, month by month, year by year. Each missed event added to their conviction that I was unreliable. Each vague explanation about my work deepened their suspicion that I was hiding something shameful. Each demonstration of my inability to commit to family plans reinforced their belief that I had serious personal problems. The professional success that should have been a source of pride and confidence became a source of guilt and anxiety. Every promotion I received, every commendation I earned, every operation I successfully completed felt hollow because I couldn't share those achievements with the people whose opinion mattered most to me. I started having nightmares about alternative scenarios where I could tell them the truth. Dreams where I brought my parents to the Pentagon for a briefing, where I showed them classified documents that proved my importance, where I introduced them to the senators and generals who valued my contributions. But I always woke up to the reality that those scenarios were impossible, that the very nature of my work made it forever invisible to the people I most wanted to impress. The months leading up to the wedding were particularly brutal because David's happiness and success were constantly being contrasted with my apparent failures. Every planning meeting, every family discussion about the event, every conversation about the guest list highlighted the disparity between the golden child who'd figured out his life and the disappointing daughter who remained a source of worry and embarrassment. I considered not attending the wedding at all.
The thought of sitting through an entire evening of celebrations centered around David's achievements while being reminded of my perceived shortcomings was almost unbearable. But skipping my brother's wedding would have been the final proof my parents needed that Catherine Hayes had completely given up on being a responsible family member. So I bought the discount dress, made the 8-hour drive, and prepared myself for an evening of humiliation that I knew would be documented in photos and videos that would preserve my apparent failures for posterity. I walked into that reception hall knowing that I would be seated with children, knowing that my father's toast would pointedly avoid mentioning me, knowing that I would spend the evening being a living reminder of my parents' disappointment. The psychological toll of maintaining that facade while carrying the real weight of my professional responsibilities was becoming unsustainable. I was briefing cabinet members on global security threats while my own family thought I needed professional help. I was coordinating international military operations while my parents were considering staging an intervention for my supposed personal problems. Sitting at that kids' table, listening to my father praise David for representing everything we hoped our children would become, I felt like I was disappearing, not just from my family's awareness, but from my own sense of identity. When you can't share your achievements, when your sacrifices go unrecognized, when your service is invisible to the people who matter most to you, you start to wonder if any of it is real. The little girl sitting next to me at the kids' table asked me what I did for work, and for a moment I couldn't answer, not because it was classified, but because I'd been living the lie for so long that I'd almost forgotten how to think about the truth.
That was the moment when I realized that something had to change. Either I would find a way to bridge the gap between my real life and my family's perception, or I would eventually lose both my family relationships and my sense of self. I just never imagined that the solution would come from Colonel Morrison's decision to risk his own security clearance to give me back my identity in front of 200 wedding guests. What I didn't know, as I sat at that children's table watching my father toast David's achievements while pointedly ignoring my existence, was that I wasn't as alone as I felt. Miles away from the Rosewood Country Club, in secure facilities and private offices across the country, people who understood exactly who Catherine Hayes really was had been watching the situation unfold with growing concern. The first person to notice something was wrong was Colonel Jennifer Walsh, my immediate superior at Strategic Operations Command. We'd worked together for 3 years, and she'd become something of a mentor as I navigated the complexities of high-level military leadership. Colonel Walsh had a reputation for taking care of her people, and she'd noticed subtle changes in my performance that others might have missed. Hayes seems off lately, she'd mentioned to General Robert Castellanos during a routine staff meeting 2 months before the wedding. Still performing at the highest level, but there's something different. She's more reserved, less confident in briefings, almost like she's questioning herself. General Castellanos had worked with enough senior officers to recognize the signs of someone carrying personal burdens that were affecting their professional demeanor. Family issues? He'd asked. That's my guess. She never talks about family, never mentions personal life. For someone at her level, that level of compartmentalization usually means problems at home. What neither of them knew at the time was that I'd stopped mentioning my family in professional settings because the growing disconnect between my work life and my personal life had become too painful to acknowledge even in passing conversation with colleagues who understood the nature of classified service. Colonel Morrison's connection to my family had been pure coincidence, or what military people sometimes call operational synchronicity. 3 months before David's wedding, he'd been attending a banking industry conference in Asherton as part of a Department of Defense liaison program designed to strengthen relationships between military leadership and civilian financial institutions. The conference was focused on cybersecurity threats to financial networks, which fell squarely within his area of expertise.
David Hayes had been one of the junior executives assigned to attend the sessions, representing his investment firm's interest in understanding military perspectives on financial security. During a break between sessions, they'd struck up a conversation about cryptocurrency vulnerabilities, a topic that happened to be one of Morrison's specializations. "You know, I have a sister who works in something related to this," David had mentioned casually. "Catherine Hayes. She does some kind of consulting work that involves financial security, though she's always vague about the details. Family joke is that we're not sure if she's being modest or if she's embarrassed about whatever it is she actually does." Morrison had gone very still. The name Catherine Hayes wasn't common, and in his line of work, he knew the names of most people operating at senior levels in financial security analysis. But the Catherine Hayes he knew wasn't a consultant. She was a general whose work on terrorist financing networks had revolutionized how the military tracked and disrupted international money laundering operations. "Your sister Catherine," Morrison had said carefully, "what's her background? Education, military service, that sort of thing?" "Westbrook University, political science and international relations. No military background in our family. She went straight into consulting work after college. Though now that I think about it, she does seem to know a lot about military and security issues. Sometimes argues with me about international conflicts like she has inside information." That conversation had confirmed Morrison's suspicions. David Hayes's mysterious sister wasn't just someone with a similar name. She was General Catherine Hayes, one of the most effective strategic intelligence officers in the United States military, whose family apparently had no idea who she really was or what she actually did for a living. Morrison had spent the next several days wrestling with what he'd learned. His security clearance prevented him from revealing classified information about my identity or work, but his professional respect for my contributions to national security made it painful to know that my own family saw me as a failure. He'd worked with me on joint operations, had been briefed on missions I'd coordinated, and understood better than most people the level of sacrifice required to serve at my level while maintaining operational security. "Sir, I have an unusual situation," he'd finally said during a secure phone call with General Castellanos, who oversaw multiple classified programs and had the authority to make decisions about information disclosure. "I've accidentally discovered that one of our senior officers has family members who are completely unaware of her service record or achievements." Morrison outlined the situation carefully, explaining how David's casual comments had revealed the extent of my family's misunderstanding about my career. He didn't request permission to disclose classified information, but he did ask for guidance on whether there were any circumstances under which my service record could be acknowledged in a family setting. "That's a hell of a situation," General Castellanos had responded after hearing the full story. "Hayes is one of our most valuable strategic assets. The work she's done on terrorist financing alone has prevented billions in funding from reaching hostile organizations. His family has no idea they're related to someone who's helped prevent actual terrorist attacks?" "None whatsoever, sir. They think she's underemployed and possibly struggling with personal issues." General Castellanos had been quiet for a long moment. "Morrison, you said David Hayes is getting married soon?"
"Yes, sir. Large wedding, lots of family and friends attending." "And you're attending as a family friend?" "I am, sir. David invited me after our conversation at the conference." Another pause. "Let me make some calls. There might be a way to handle this that doesn't compromise operational security, but does give Hayes some recognition for her service. She's earned that much." Those calls had reached surprising levels within the Department of Defense. General Castellanos had consulted with the Secretary of the Army's office, with Pentagon legal counsel, and with intelligence oversight committees about the possibility of acknowledging my rank and general service record without disclosing specific operational details. The consensus had been unanimous. Someone who had served with my level of distinction deserved to have their achievements acknowledged by their family, even if the specific details of those achievements remained classified. My rank was a matter of public record. even if my assignments weren't. The fact that I held the rank of general was information that could be disclosed to family members without compromising national security. Meanwhile, other allies were emerging from unexpected directions. Major Elena Rodriguez, who'd worked with me on the cryptocurrency analysis that had first brought me to Morrison's attention, had been dealing with similar family challenges in her own life. Her husband and children knew she was in the military, but they had no understanding of the significance of her work or the level of operations she was involved in. Quote, "It's like being successful in a language your family doesn't speak," she'd explained to Colonel Walsh during a conversation about work-life balance in classified careers. "My kids think I have a boring desk job because I can't tell them about the missions that matter. My husband thinks I'm just another mid-level officer because he's never seen me receive recognition for anything significant." Rodriguez had been following my situation with personal interest because she recognized the psychological toll of carrying professional achievements that couldn't be shared with loved ones. When Morrison approached her about the possibility of attending David's wedding to provide context for my service record, she'd immediately volunteered to help coordinate what they privately called Operation Family Recognition. The plan they developed was elegant in its simplicity. Morrison would attend the wedding as invited, but instead of just participating as a civilian friend of the groom, he would use his military background and knowledge of my service record to provide appropriate recognition for my achievements in a family setting. Quote, "The goal isn't to reveal classified information. The goal is to make sure her family understands that Catherine Hayes is someone they should be proud of, not someone they should worry about," unquote. Morrison explained to Rodriguez during their planning conversation. Rodriguez had spent hours researching what aspects of my service record could be legally disclosed in a social setting. My rank was public information. The general nature of my work in strategic intelligence could be acknowledged without specifics. My educational achievements through military programs were matters of record. The fact that I'd received commendations and recognition at the highest levels of government could be mentioned without details. Quote, "What we're going to do," Morrison had told General Castellanos during their final planning call, "is give her family enough information to understand that their assumptions about Catherine's career have been completely wrong, without telling them anything specific enough to compromise operational security." Unquote. None of them had consulted me about this plan. They couldn't because doing so would have required revealing Morrison's connection to my family and potentially compromising my cover for future operations. But they'd all agreed that I'd earned the right to have my service recognized by the people who mattered most to me, even if that recognition came as a surprise. Standing there in that reception hall, watching Colonel Morrison rise to give what everyone assumed would be a standard best man speech, I had no idea that this moment had been planned for weeks by military colleagues who respected my service too much to let my family continue believing I was a disappointment. I was about to discover that while I'd felt completely alone in my struggle to balance classified service with family relationships, I'd actually had allies working behind the scenes to solve a problem I thought was unsolvable. The silence that followed Colonel Morrison's salute seemed to stretch for hours, though it probably lasted less than 30 seconds. In that suspended moment, I watched 7 years of carefully constructed family dynamics collapse and rebuild themselves in real time. The woman my parents had worried about, lectured, and quietly given up on had just been revealed as someone they'd never imagined could exist within their own family. My father was the first to move. Richard Hayes, the man who'd built his career on managing information and controlling narratives, stood up slowly from his seat at the head table. His face had gone through several color changes, white with shock, red with embarrassment, then settling into something I'd never seen before, genuine awe mixed with what looked like shame. "Catherine," he said, his voice carrying across the still silent reception hall, "why didn't you tell us?" It was such a simple question, but loaded with the weight of everything that had gone wrong between us. How do you explain to your father that you couldn't tell him about your achievements because doing so would violate federal law? How do you make a parent understand that your silence wasn't about shame or secrecy, but about protecting operations that could save lives? "Dad," I started, my own voice sounding strange in the quiet room,
I couldn't. The work I do, the level I operate at, it requires security clearances that limit what I can discuss, even with family.
Colonel Morrison stepped forward, understanding that this moment needed careful management. "Sir, if I may," he said, addressing my father with the kind of respectful authority that only comes from military training. "Your daughter's service record is exemplary, but much of her work involves classified operations that affect national security. What I can tell you is that General Hayes has served with distinction in assignments that have directly contributed to American safety and international stability." The words General Hayes seemed to echo in the room. I watched my mother's hand fly to her mouth as the full impact of my rank finally registered. A general! Her daughter, who couldn't seem to get her life together, who lived in a modest apartment and drove an old car, who couldn't explain her work or commit to family events, was a general in the United States military? General, my mother whispered, the word coming out like she was testing its weight. "Catherine, you're a general?" "Yes, ma'am," Colonel Morrison answered when I seemed unable to find my voice. "General Hayes has been serving at the strategic level for several years, coordinating operations that I'm not at liberty to describe in detail, but which have had significant impact on national defense and international cooperation." David had been sitting frozen throughout this exchange, but now he stood up too, his face a mixture of confusion and what might have been pride. "Catherine, the things you've said about military conflicts, the way you always seem to know more than the news was reporting?" "She was briefed on situations before they became public knowledge," Morrison confirmed. "General Hayes works at levels where information flows differently than civilian news cycles." The guests were beginning to stir, conversations starting and stopping as people tried to process what they were witnessing. Mrs. Pemberton was staring at me with an expression of complete bewilderment, probably remembering every condescending comment she'd made about my career prospects over the years. But it was my parents' reaction that mattered most. My mother had tears streaming down her face, though whether they were from pride, guilt, or overwhelming confusion, I couldn't tell. My father looked like he was mentally reviewing every conversation we'd had about responsibility and commitment, every lecture about making something of myself, every disappointed comment about my life choices. "All those times we worried about you," my mother said, her voice breaking. "All those times we thought you were struggling or lost or just couldn't figure out what you wanted to do with your life. You were serving your country," my father finished. And there was something in his voice I'd never heard before. Not just pride, but respect. The kind of respect that Richard Hayes, successful attorney and pillar of the community, reserved for people he genuinely admired. Colonel Morrison handed me something I hadn't noticed him carrying, a small presentation box. "General Hayes, I took the liberty of bringing something that your family should see." Inside the box was my Bronze Star Medal, earned for exceptional service during a classified operation that had prevented a terrorist attack on American interests overseas. It was one of several commendations I'd received that my family had never known about, never seen, never been able to celebrate. "This is just one of several decorations your daughter has earned," Morrison explained to my parents. "I can't tell you the specific circumstances, but I can tell you that this medal represents heroism and service that saved lives." My father reached for the medal with hands that weren't quite steady. Richard Hayes had always been proud of his ability to evaluate character, to assess situations, to understand what was really happening beneath surface appearances. But he'd completely misread his own daughter for 7 years, and I could see him grappling with what that meant about his judgment, his assumptions, and his understanding of the people he was supposed to know best. "Catherine," he said finally, looking up from the medal to meet my eyes, "I owe you an apology. We owe you an apology. We should have trusted that you knew what you were doing even when we couldn't understand it." The transformation in the room was palpable. Guests who'd been seated quietly were now openly staring, many of them pulling out phones to discreetly capture what they probably realized was a historic family moment.
Rebecca looked like she was trying to process the fact that her new sister-in-law was someone who could theoretically order military operations that might affect international relations. But the most significant change was in my family's posture, their body language, the way they were looking at me. For the first time in 7 years, I wasn't the disappointing daughter who couldn't get her life together. I was someone they were genuinely proud to be related to, someone whose achievements reflected well on their family name, someone worthy of the kind of respect they'd always shown David's accomplishments. "Mom, Dad," I said, my voice stronger now. "I know this is confusing, and I know it raises questions about why I couldn't tell you before. But I need you to understand that everything I did, every time I had to be secretive or evasive, it wasn't because I was ashamed of my work. It was because the work was too important to risk compromising." My mother stood up and walked around the table to where I was standing. For a moment, I thought she might be angry about the years of deception, the missed opportunities for celebration, the worry we'd put her through unnecessarily.
Instead, she wrapped me in the kind of hug I hadn't received from her since childhood. The kind that said she was proud of who I'd become, not disappointed in who I wasn't. "My daughter, the general," she whispered in my ear, and I could hear the smile in her voice even though I couldn't see her face. David approached more hesitantly, probably still processing the fact that his older sister, who he'd been patronizing for years about responsibility and career advancement, actually outranked most of the people he'd ever met in professional settings. "Catherine, I don't know what to say. All those times I thought I was the successful one in the family and you were..." "Doing what I was trained to do," I finished for him, "just like you've been doing what you were trained to do. We've both been serving in our own ways." The wedding reception continued, but it was fundamentally different now. Instead of being the family disappointment relegated to the children's table, I was General Catherine Hayes, someone whose service had earned the respect and recognition of everyone in the room. Conversations that had avoided the topic of my career now centered on questions about military service, strategic operations, and the kind of leadership required to reach general rank. But more than the external recognition, what mattered was the restoration of my relationship with my family. The distance that had grown between us over 7 years of misunderstanding began to close as they finally understood that my secretiveness hadn't been about failure or shame, but about serving something larger than myself. Late that evening, as the reception was winding down, my father approached me one final time. "Catherine, I want you to know that even before I knew about your rank, about your service, about any of this, I always loved you. I was worried about you, frustrated sometimes, but I never stopped loving you." "I know, Dad. And I want you to know that serving my country has been an honor, but being your daughter has always been the foundation that made everything else possible." The wedding that had started as David's celebration had become something else entirely. The moment when Catherine Hayes stopped living a double life and became whole again. The family that had been divided by misunderstanding and incomplete information was reunited by truth, respect, and the recognition that love doesn't always look the way we expect it to. As I drove home that night, still wearing my discount department store dress, but carrying my Bronze Star medal and the restored pride of my family, I realized that Colonel Morrison hadn't just given me back my identity, he'd given me back my family. And for someone who'd spent 7 years choosing between service to country and acceptance by the people I loved most, that was the greatest victory of all. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.